In this session, I'm going to talk about the supervisory guidelines, especially for the advanced measurement approach for operational risk. We know that advanced measurement approach is a kind of flexibility that the banks and financial institutions have with respect to measuring the frequency of the losses and severity of their losses. Based on that, try to understand their exposure. So use some kind of quantitative mechanisms and all for trying to compute the amount that is typically at risk for them and do the capital planning accordingly. Right? So there is some level of flexibility in terms of the model that is being offered to the banks for computing their operational risk capital chart. But in the middle of that particular flexibilities, there are a few supervisory guidelines as well. Now, when we talk about the developing the operational risk management framework, measurement framework, there are good number of challenges. One with the development of it, with the implementation of it, with the maintenance of it. Because at the end, whatever the framework that a bank develops, implements for operational risk management or operational risk measurement, it should be in line with the requirements of Basel II. So, how to resolve all these kinds of challenges? That is where these supervisory guidelines are coming into picture. How do you identify different kinds of challenges? How do you resolve them so that there is a successful development, implementation and maintenance of the advanced management approach framework? And so there are a few entities that have to work together. One, the internal governance. What are the controls and the governance mechanisms that are there? What is how the data is handled? How the modeling frameworks are existing? So there are supervisory guidelines that are surrounding all these aspects, so that a convergence of the practices, more of uniformity comes up across the banks and even the supervisory authorities. So that's the important aspect of these supervisory guidelines. So let's look at that. We know that the Basel framework, Basel 1, 2, 3, whatever it is, the intention of any Basel framework is to strengthen the soundness of the banking system, stability of the banking system. So there should be some amount of consistency, but AMA framework is more about flexibility in terms of computing the operational risk capital. So this is where the guidelines has to act on the top of this flexibility, because at the end there should be a lot of consistency. So that the capital adequacy regulation that is being put up, it can't be a source of inequality, right? I should be able to compare between the companies quite comfortably. Only then I can, or as a regulator, the consistency can come up. So we have to understand the fact, or Basel had typically looked at the fact that the operational risk management is more and more of an evolving discipline. So there should be some level of flexibility for the banks to develop their own operational risk management and measurement framework. And that became a very critical aspect of the entire Basel process. So while providing flexibility, how do we ensure consistency in the application of that? Now this is where the supervisory guidelines have come up, and the intention of the supervisory guidelines is identify and encourage the different kinds of operational risk management practices that are followed by the bank, which really can play a role in coming up with very effective operational risk management and measurement system. So identify them, encourage the bank to go ahead with them, keep monitoring them so that the consistency between the various international banks is achieved. Now, in that process, one of the major aspects to be looked at is the verification and the validation aspect. So, the models that the bank has developed get into the verification and validation of that. We know it's a third line of defense where there is an independent audit function. The first line of defense will be your the line itself, the business line itself. The second level of thing is corporate operational risk management function, and the third level is the independent audit or verification and validation in the governance structure, which is being used for measurement and management of operation risk. So the layer 2, which is the corporate operational risk management function, and the operational risk management systems the company has developed, the effectiveness of all these things need to be reviewed by one competent, qualified, independent internal or external auditors. And as a part of this process, the supervisors have to really ensure that the risk management framework that the bank has developed is functioning as intended and it is in line with the risk profile of the bank. It's very, very important for implementation of an effective overall operational risk management framework. So when we are doing a verification and validation, almost all the activities and components which go into the operational risk management framework and systems, they all need to be considered. They all need to be consistent with the objectives and goals of the firm as well as in line with the Basel II requirement and in line with the complexity of the risk that we are managing. So what happens in validation and what happens in verification? In validation, the system that is used for operational risk management needs to be evaluated and needs to be assessed if it is robust enough. If all the kinds of stress scenarios are taken care of as a part of the system. So the intention is how integrated are the inputs to the outputs, how good and realistic are the assumptions, the process, and the final output that are generated out of the system, and get an assurance or give an assurance that the methodology or the process for risk management that is followed is giving us whatever the operational risk capital charge that system is giving, it is a reliable and a credible estimate. And it is reflecting the risk profile of the bank in an appropriate manner. So you really need not restrict yourself to only the quantitative models here. You can even look at the validation associated with the inputs, how good they are, process and the methodology to compute the model, and even the output, so that the overall risk management framework and system is in place and the calculations regarding the operational risk capital are quite effectively taken care of. So that happens in a validation framework. But when we talk about the verification, we are verifying the framework. Validation, we are validating the system. In verification, we are verifying the framework on a periodic basis. So the verification happens either through an internal audit or an external audit. So for a few periods, there could be an internal audit followed by an external audit at a higher frequency kind of a period. So the test the effectiveness of the entire framework, look at how much consistent they are with respect to the policies that are set by the board of directors and the senior management of the firm. And you test whether the system that has been developed, the validation process for the system that we have developed, for the ORMS that has been developed, to ensure that the system is independent and it is implemented in line with the policies of the company. So verification and validation is one core aspect which will drive the effectiveness of the AMA framework. Then comes the use test and the experience. Here we always use the word called embeddedness. It is the level to which the operation risk management framework is embedded, whether it is framework or processes or practices or whatever it is. So to what extent this framework, the various components of this framework have penetrated into the different layers of the organizational hierarchy in a bank. To what extent the employees at different layers, at different levels, they understand the operation risk management framework. They implement the operation risk management framework as a part of their day-to-day activities. So, from the bank's management perspective, they have to ensure that the embeddedness is not adversely impacted over time. Right? People are following it, but it's not adversely impacting the operations of the bank. So there should be sustainable framework. The policies that the bank is using for risk management, the decision-making practices, they all need to be sustainable. They all need to be embedded across the layers in the organization. And the framework should be updated on a regular basis, and that updated one also need to be communicated across the layers, across the business processes. And from a management standpoint, from a strategic department standpoint, from a business planning section standpoint, right, which are the strategy related activities, they should consider the operational risk profile of the bank while preparing a strategic plan for the company. The operational risk profile of the bank has to be considered. What are the outputs the operational risk management system is typically generating, and based on that the strategic goals and objectives of the bank need to be designed. And from the perspective of the board, what is the risk appetite? A very clear statement to what amount of risk we are going to bear. What is the tolerance level of the bank with respect to the operation risk? The statement should be very clearly mentioning this aspect. And the bank should have appropriate processes in place to monitor the controls that are identified, and they have to ensure that they are sufficient and appropriate to mitigate the risks that are identified effectively. Now, across the layer, the company or the management, whether it is for the entire company or for a single business unit, they should be in a position to clearly demonstrate how the operation risk framework is implemented within that particular organization or that particular business unit. So different kinds of processes, practices, procedures, policies, everything, they should be able to demonstrate how the entire implementation, validation, verification of the risk management framework and how it is integrated, how the framework is integrated into the overall decision making process of the organization. So the risk profile of the bank, it should take into consideration both the internal environment, which are the internal stakeholders and all, and the external environment, talking about the macroeconomic factors, then looking at the industry related dynamics, etc. Then comes the reporting. It should be very clear. It should clearly demonstrate that the management understood all the key operational risks, the drivers for all the risks, and how effective is the risk management implementation in the organization. So there should be a regular reporting. The frequency of this should be identified and clearly stated across all the levels of the bank. And whatever the report that is being generated, it needs to be transparent. Any kind of changes, it should be responsive to that, and it should really focus on proactive management rather than a reactive management of operation risk. And all the elements of the operation risk management system, there should be a clear definition of the performance management criteria and the outputs for the same. So that's one aspect of use testing. So testing the use of operational risk management framework and systems within a bank. How long has the bank been? What is the kind of experience the bank management and personnel have in terms of using the operational risk management framework and systems across the various layers? How much embedded is the operational risk management framework within that particular bank? Then again, every bank has to really choose what are the operation risk categories. They could be unique to each bank depending on the kind of the business model that it is following. So, but still there are a few guidelines to work on it. The risk management system of the bank and the capital charge, ORCC, operational risk capital charge. So they are greatly influenced by the number of categories that we are using in the model. So the higher is the number of categories, there is a good chance that the ORCC is higher. So, so that's where the problem comes. How many ORCs, how many categories do we need to identify? But one thing is clear, whatever are the ORCs of a bank, they are unique to that particular bank, because each bank may have a different business model, each bank may have a different risk profile. So ORC should be in line with the business model and the risk profile of the bank. So there should be a clear assessment of the complexity of the business activities and the operational risk the bank is exposed to. So the model that is developed for computing ORCC, it has to take into account the risks which are specific to that of the bank. So it should consider the business profile, which could differ from bank to bank, the risk profile, the risk appetite. So history of operational losses, any chances where the bank has lost much higher than the average. The external business environment, where I look at the macroeconomic factors, the industry dynamics, etc. And any kinds of risks that are common across the group, there should be some kind of a grouping wherever appropriate. Now coming to the ORCs, I really need to differentiate between too high versus too low. There should be a kind of a balance. Granularity will give me too high categories and the volume of the historical data in each class. Because if I have too many categories, I may not have a good volume of data in each of the categories. Right? Because that much of historical data is not available. So I have to strike a balance, especially when I'm using the loss distribution approach, where I have to really identify a kind of a distribution for the severity of my losses and frequency of losses. If there is no sufficient data, identifying a distribution becomes more and more tougher. So if I am having just a few ORCs, very few, then the grouping may not be homogeneous. Different kinds of events might be falling under one single ORC. So the homogeneity of that ORC is not getting established. But at the same time, if I am having a very high number of ORCs, then it means the volume of the data in each of the ORC could be extremely lesser. So the model may not be affected. So the losses in each category can fall below a threshold. So that's where I could lose out on both the scores. And whatever the choice, whether it is more or less, it should not adversely impact the other factors of the operational risk model. See, I should be able to do a diversification within the various elements and the correlations between the various categories. So they should not be affected because of the choice of the number of categories that the bank has chosen. So there should be both qualitative as well as quantitative measures to determine what are the different ORCs and how many ORCs are typically required. And on the other side, as I have said here, the higher the number of ORCs, the higher could be your capital charge, especially when you are not considering the correlation that is existing between the different ORCs. Right? So because you are simply summing up the stuff, the ORCC capital charge could be much higher. But if you are using correlation, then what is the way I can define the correlation between each of the pairs? So because the number of pairs are higher, defining the correlation between each of the pairs is again a very difficult assumption. The set of assumptions that I have to take would be abnormally higher. So the higher the number of ORCs is always a difficult process, but we have to really think how many ORCs are really required. And the capital allocation to the internal business lines also need to be considered. On what factor, on what basis the capital allocation happens to the internal business line. So these kind of guidelines need to be kept in mind while we are doing the selection of the operational risk categories for a bank. Then, coming to the identification of the probability distribution. So first thing, the process should be very much in place, documented, traceable. So first of all, the process for how do I select what kind of probability distribution, right? On what basis I am selecting a specific probability distribution, both for the frequency of losses as well as for the severity. How do I update? At what frequency? When am I reviewing it? Well, how do I check whether it is appropriate or not? So there should be a clear-cut process regarding the selection, the update and review of the distribution that we have that we are using for estimating the operational risk capital and estimating the parameters. So it should be very much consistent with the risk profile of the bank and the entire risk profile, especially in the tail, need to be captured. We know that the severity distributions generally are medium-tailed or heavy-tailed. So depending on the kind of the distribution that we have chosen, it is going to seriously impact the overall outcome. Because if I take a very heavy-tailed distribution, the outcome could be much higher. The tail outcome could be much higher. If I'm taking a medium tail kind of a distribution, the tail outcome could be slightly lesser. So what probability distribution that we are choosing, it should be more and more consistent with all the elements of the AMA model. So what are we looking at when we are creating a model for the probability distribution? One, it should be realistic. So the loss distribution that it is generating, it should be in line with reality. It should be more and more well specified. Whatever the data that we are fitting from, whatever the model that we are fitting to the data, it should be more or less similar to the loss data, and it should be more or less consistent with it. More flexible, right? Even if the data changes a little bit, it should be able to accommodate that. Wide variety of empirical data needs to be accommodated into that model. And finally, it should be easy to implement. Simulation should be very much possible on that particular model. So that is all those things need to be taken care of for assessing the suitability of a particular model. And as a process, we should be able to perform exploratory data analysis for each ORC, which means in-depth analysis of each and every ORC, get a good hold of the statistical profile of the category, and based on that come out with the most appropriate distribution. So you can use different kinds of tools like scatter plots, autocorrelation plots, empirical distribution plots, histograms, regression analysis, PP plots, QQ plots, mean excess plot. Different kinds of statistical processes can very well be used to get a good understanding or the initial understanding regarding the type and shape of the probability distribution that we really require. And based on that, the appropriate techniques can very well be used for estimation of the distributional parameters. And the appropriate diagnostic tools can be used for evaluating the quality of fitment. I can use a chi-square test or some such kind of mechanisms for assessing the quality of fit of the distribution to the data. Now, just getting a little bit into the specifics. Severity. The tail is modeled separately and the body is modeled separately, because body is nothing but high frequency, low intensity kind of data, whereas tail is low frequency, high intensity kind of data. So many banks, they are typically following two separate distributions for the body as well as the tail. And many a times we see that the operational risk data has a very high positive skewness and the kurtosis is going to be much higher. So it's a leptokurtic kind of a distribution. So I cannot use simple normal empirical curves to estimate the tail region, because the extrapolation becomes much difficult beyond the last point. So I have to depend heavily on the sub-exponential distributions itself. All those heavy-tailed kind of distributions, they come under the sub-exponential kind of distribution. They need to be used. So in some of them, the number of parameters are much higher, right? Even the characteristics of the tail are very much specified there. Probably if I am looking at a Frischet distribution, or a Gumbel kind of a distribution, or a Weibel kind of a distribution, I could see that the number of parameters are generalized Pareto kind of a distribution. All the extreme value based distribution, they are having a higher number of parameters. So which means they can very well represent the shape of the data in the tail more effectively compared to the light tailed ones. And because we are using different kinds of distributions for the body and the tail, the threshold, what is the cutoff between the body and the tail? When are we using the tail and when are we using the body? At what point? Right? Probably if I say the data is more like this, or I say up to here it is the body and from here it is the tail. So I need to have a body tail threshold which will distinguish up to where the body model has to be used and from where to where the tail model has to be used. So that threshold has to be made not in isolation, but it has to be in line with the parameters of the distribution itself. So it has to be dynamic. So I should have a very solid mechanism to really identify the threshold as well as the distribution. And more attention has to be made to the different kurtosis related parameters which describe the tail region. Because they are more and more unstable, that parameters will become more and more unstable because the number of actual data points that we have could be very limited. The data could be much scarce. So the number of data points that are available for modeling the same could be much limited. And the methodologies that we are using to estimate the variability and provide the measures of the error around these estimates. So the estimation methods that we are using, they need to be very much robust. So they should be able to highlight which observations are deviating substructures have a good influence on the statistic that we are estimating. So there should be a quality of fitment, data versus the distribution. What is the goodness of fit? So different kinds of goodness of fit tests can be performed to really see which distribution is appropriately fitting with the historical data. So there could be a usage of graphical methods, quantitative methods, which are like chi-square tests and all, which are focusing on the goodness of fit. But the only drawback that we find with the goodness of fit tests is they are very much sensitive to the sample size. They are very much sensitive to the parameters that we are estimating. So that's where we can even rely on the relative performance of the distribution. We can use the likelihood ratio test, the Akaike information criteria, Schwartz-Bayesian information criteria, BIC or AIC. Any of these kind of mechanisms can very well be used to assess the relative performance of the distribution. And on a regular basis, I have to keep verifying the assumptions, the appropriateness of the assumptions to the model, the distributions that we are using, are they still appropriate? So there should be a regular review of all the distributions for all kinds of data. And generally, if we look at majority of the banks, they use the same curve for modeling the severity of the data across all ORCs. Generally, the log normal distribution is being adopted by the banks for modeling the different severities across all the ORC categories. So whatever the loss distribution that is chosen to model the scenario analysis estimate, we have to make sure that it is in line with the risk profile of the ORC. We have to really evaluate whether using the same curve for different kinds of ORCs is actually appropriate, or if required, suggest kind of modifications to those kind of the specific ORCs, so that different ORCs follow different kinds of distribution. Then once the individual ORCs, the losses are identified, then comes the aggregation of the same. So during this aggregation, the supervisory guidelines talk about ensure that precision and stability exists with the risk measures. The rules of any coherent risk measure, if you recollect, they should be monotonic, supplemented with information on the level of accuracy. So they should be more and more reasonable. So the risk measures should be more and more coherent. So I have to make sure that all the properties associated with the coherent, subadditivity, the monotonic, right, the transitivity, all of them are really in place. And in general, what we see is banks use a lot of quantitative models to generate the aggregate loss distribution. They rely on statistics heavily. to generate the aggregate loss distribution. So different kinds of numerical methods, they are the ones that are deriving the aggregate curves. And many a times the simulations are playing an important role, because coming out with a closed form formulas becomes very difficult for the aggregate loss distribution. So generally the simulation, so the number of steps in a Monte Carlo simulation, the number of steps that are being used to perform the simulation becomes very important, right? If the number of steps is too high versus too low, what is the difference? They should be consistent with the shape of the distribution and the confidence level that we wanted to achieve. Because the more and more the number of iterations that I am performing, the scope for lesser and lesser error and higher confidence level increases. The confidence interval becomes more and more narrower if we are trying to perform more and more kind of iterations. Now, if the distribution of the losses is heavy tail and I'm trying to measure at a very high confidence level, okay, heavy tail and a high confidence level, the number of steps should be sufficiently large, and vice versa. So I can very well see when should I have more number of steps and when should I have less number of steps if I am performing any kind of simulation activity. But apart from that, if I'm not using Monte Carlo simulation, I'm following Fourier transform or any other numerical methods, then what is the stability of the algorithm that we are using? What are the different possibilities of error creeping up in the model? They all needs to be focused. And finally, what is the kind of risk measure that we are using? Because from whatever the loss distribution that the model has generated, we are trying to identify the risk measure out of it, which is one single value that is being extracted out of that particular distribution at a desired confidence level. Generally, value at risk is a number that is being used for that purpose. But more and more popularity has started coming out for shortfall measures like expected shortfall, median shortfall. Some such kind of shortfall measures are gaining a lot of acceptance, especially for modeling the tail region and coming out with a coherent risk estimate. So the risk measures are more and more realistic. We have to ensure that the risk measures are more realistic from a managerial perspective as well as from an economic standpoint. But at the same time, the bank should really understand that whatever the ORCC, risk capital charge, that it has computed, there is a lot of uncertainty that is associated with it. One, because of scarcity of the data, because we have very little number of actual operational losses which have crossed bigger threshold. So because of the scarcity of the data and the heaviness of the tail, it becomes very difficult for arriving at parameters which are more and more consistent. So that's one aspect which the bank should be very careful of, and it has to understand that that level of uncertainty is going to exist in their estimates. Then, what are the typical guidelines that are driving the correlation effects, the modeling of the correlation? Right? First of all, whatever the assumptions that are associated with the correlation, one, they should be very much supported with the empirical data along with an expert judgment. So which is both quantitative as well as qualitatively, that assumption need to be validated. And we have to really understand, first of all, am I using only the internal data or even the external data to model the dependence? Internal data is very limited. External data may not be in line with the risk profile of the bank. And both of them, the number of data points are very much limited. So that's one point where we need to be aware of. Whatever the judgment that we are using to model the correlation and the dependence, even it has its own set of challenges. Because coming out with accurate but qualitative estimate is not that easy. So, what should be the dependence structure? How should the correlation between the different categories need to be modeled? That becomes the most important significant challenge in a AMA modeling framework. So whatever the assumptions regarding the dependence and correlation, they should be more and more conservative. So whatever the uncertainties regarding the dependency modeling, they need to be clearly understood and taken care of. I should not look at normality between the two categories, because that will significantly underestimate the amount of dependence between the tail events. So a normal correlation kind of stuff may not be an appropriate factor to model the dependence here. That's the reason Coppola's kind of approaches are more and more suited to model the dependence here, especially with respect to the tails. So there should be a degree of conservatism. The more and more reliable I want my capital requirement estimates to come out, I require more and more conservatism. Should increase, the degree of conservatism should increase as the reliability of the resulting capital requirements estimate decreases. I should be more, so if in reality my estimate is becoming more and more unreliable, then I should be more and more conservative in the correlation estimate that I am coming up. So there should be a trade-off between the rigor and conservatism. Now, coming to, let's say we have identified different ORCs. The losses within each ORC, they should be independent. Otherwise, modeling a dependence between them is going to be a big challenge. Right? Modeling the intercorrelation that is existing within the elements of an ORC becomes a very complicated process. And whatever the dependence which we are creating between the different ORCs, it should not be affected because of the granularity level. Just because I have chosen 2 versus 5, the dependence should not be adversely affecting the entire process. And the bank should perform the sensitivity analysis and stress testing, assuming different numbers for correlations, dependence between the various ORCs, and based on that it should finally come out with different distribution, or a distribution of the outcomes, and based on that it has to typically work out on the risk measure. And it is very difficult to meaningfully differentiate the impact of dependence at one bank versus the other, because each bank has its own risk profile, each bank has its own business operations which are more and more unique to that particular bank. And there comes the usage of the 4 data elements as a part of the computation of the AMA framework. Internal loss data, external data, scenarios that are getting generated, and the business environment and internal control factors. So how are these 4 elements used to come out with a coherent operational risk capital computation? So all these have to be taken into consideration to produce a credible and a robust estimate of ORCC. And the inputs, these are the major inputs into the AMA model, and all these should be in line with the risk profile of the bank and the risk management practices that the bank has already put into. So if I look at each of them separately, looking at the internal loss data, the actual loss experience of the bank. So it should really help the bank in terms of computing loss frequencies. To a large extent, they help in computation of the distribution for severity. And all this data can go as an input into the scenario analysis, the scenarios that are getting generated. So these two will go more and more into historical data, and this will go more of a forward looking kind of a data. And generally the data availability for low frequency, high severity or high intensity kind of events within each bank, the number is very limited, right? Limited high severity internal loss events. So the data for modeling the tail of the distribution for the computation of the capital charge is pretty limited. So this is where probably the bank may have to rely on the external data or the different kinds of scenarios for producing the meaningful estimate of the capital requirement. So that's on the internal loss data front, right? We can look at the external loss data and scenario analysis, and then we'll come back to the business environment back. Okay. So looking at the external data, okay, at least compared to the internal loss data, there is a possibility of the large actual losses that are not experienced by the bank that are being shown here. So the data set could be slightly higher compared to that of internal loss data. And because the loss data of this particular bank is not displayed, it is only increasing the data set. So it is a complement to the internal loss data. It is not a kind of it's not an overkill with the internal loss data. So because of more data, slightly a better possibility that the tail of the distribution can be very much comfortably modeled. And it provides an even this external data provides a decent input into the scenario analysis, because it is focusing not just on the losses the company has faced but the entire industry. The losses that have been occurring across the entire industry are being considered here. So the external data really makes an important sense, especially when a bank wants to enter into a new business line, which it is not entered into, but the industry different banks have already entered into. So assessing the risk profile of the new business lines, if I have to do a new benchmarking, and especially to understand what is the kind of loss experience of the competitors, usage of the external data into the model will really play an important role. And external losses, I may not consider as, they may not be in line with the risk profile of a particular bank, right? So that could be one of the limitations. So there should be a very clear-cut process to really assess how relevant is this external data to the risk profile of the bank. How relevant are the scale of the loss amounts that the external data is producing to the business model and the risk profile of the particular bank. So assessing that is an interesting aspect, right? Then the third important data element being the scenario analysis, more and more qualitative in nature compared to the earlier two. So it purely depends on the scenarios that we are generating. So the output that are coming out of the process, there could be some level of uncertainties associated with this output. So this is not an actual data. This is more forward looking, right? These are more kind of scenarios that are generated based on the historical experience. So to generate these kind of scenarios, the process should be clearly defined and repeatable. So background preparation should be good, especially for all the participants in the scenario generation process. So there should be qualified and experienced people who are involved in the scenario generation process. The process should be more and more structured. What data needs to be used for selection and development of the scenario. The documentation should be of high quality, which should clearly provide a support to the entire scenario output. And the process should be in place, especially when there are changes in the internal, external environment. The scenarios need to be captured accordingly and be added and be changed accordingly. So a robust independent challenge process, especially by CORF, operational risk management function, it should clearly ensure what kind of scenario estimates need to be used. So that's how the scenario analysis also plays an important role. And finally, coming to the business environment, again, this is also a forward looking assessment of the different kinds of risk factors the business is facing and what are the kind of controls, the governance mechanisms which are existing within the bank. So if I am incorporating all these things into the capital model, there is a lot of subjectivity, right? All the BECIF tools, they are more and more subjective in nature. So in general, all these BECIFs, they are used as an indirect input into the quantification framework. So basically it is like finally once the output comes, I do a plus or minus to that. Either at a group level or at a business unit level or at the entire business line level. So I can do it at any of the levels, but first I compute the quantitative output and based on the business environment or based on the internal control factors, I do a plus or minus some percentage or some dollars to finally improve your model output. So regarding that, the bank should have a very clear policy guideline. So how much up or how much down? What is the maximum increase or decrease we can give to the output of the model? And that should be well documented. Policy should be very much in place. The policy should be reviewed and all the adjustments that we are doing, they should be well supported and regular review and scrutiny of the same should be done. Based on the size of the adjustment, the level of supervisory scrutiny also need to be done accordingly. If the adjustment is too high, the scrutiny should be so high and vice versa. So a very good understanding is all these four elements, the key data elements, they play a very important role in the AMA framework, right? Then comes the process of combining all these elements. So all the four elements now I have identified, the bank has identified, now it has to come out with how they need to be combined to ensure that the ORCC is in line with the level of risk exposure of the bank. So the ownership of the outcomes need to be encouraged and it should be understood by the business. So there should not be any kind of disconnect between the measurement and management of the operational risk. And it should provide the opportunity for development of integrated self-consistent modeling framework. And how I combine all these four data elements, it should be based on a very solid statistical methodology, right? So that's how we look at the different kinds of supervisory guidelines that are concerning the operational risk. Thanks a lot for listening to this session. Thank you very much.